Kitco News special coverage of Bitcoin 2023 is brought to you by Coin Payments. Crypto payments made easy.
Lyn, I do want to touch on the idea of energy and Bitcoin mining in this part of the interview, because you did give a speech or presentation about the idea of Bitcoin mining and energy on the stage at the conference. And you made the point that you think there's too much focus on the energy that Bitcoin mining consumes rather than the productivity that is generated by Bitcoin. Elaborate on that.
So with any new technology, there's always technology proponents that want to embrace it and accelerate it. And there's people that detract from it, or are worried about the safety of it, are worried about the impacts of it. And then in more corrupt ways, entrenched industries don't want it to flourish. So for example, when the automobile came out, the horse and buggy industry wanted to impose all sorts of restrictions on it to try to kind of slow that down. And I think we're in an environment now where the existing system, whether it's governments, whether it's banking systems, would not exactly be thrilled with a much larger Bitcoin network. And so I think that it's in their interest to kind of, I can see from their perspective why they want to put all these frictions on it. And generally what you see, for example, like, Brad Sherman, he's one of the most vocal Bitcoin and crypto critics. And if you look at who are the biggest donors to his campaign, it's mostly financial institutions, which I think is not a coincidence. And so in some way, I think there's public misperception around Bitcoin, but then there's also entrenched interests. And when you look at Bitcoin mining specifically, that's usually one of the most popular angles to attack it on. Instead of someone saying, I don't like Bitcoin, but people can own it if they want, they say, well, if they keep owning it, they're going to boil the ocean. So we have to take action on them. And you'll often see, so statistics are funny because they can always be used in ways that sound sensationalist and then also sound completely benign. So for example, you can say Bitcoin uses more electricity than Argentina. That sounds horrific. That sounds like something is out of control, right? Yeah. But if you say Bitcoin uses 0.1% of global energy usage and something like 0.5% of global electricity usage, does that sound like, is that where we should have a lot of our attention? Probably not, especially if it's actually serving a productive new use. Similarly, if you say Bitcoin mining uses about as much energy as the zinc mining industry, is that like a catastrophe? Probably not. So any large industry, if you take a sufficient large industry and compare it to a country that uses, sub 1% of global energy, you're going to have what sounds like a very sensationalist comparison. Yeah. And that's been, I think, unfairly used against Bitcoin. I also think that another thing that's poorly understood is that Bitcoin uses mostly non-rival energy, meaning that by the industry's very competitive nature, they have to find the lowest electricity prices. And what are the cheapest energy prices? Usually energy sources that are stranded. Someone built a hydro dam and there's all this electricity being produced and there's not enough buyers of electricity near it. So Bitcoin miners will come in and say, well, we'll buy it for 2 cents a kilowatt hour and we'll make use of it. And so the question is that harming anyone else? No. And you always have specific anecdotes of, a miner causing an area, like a region to have some sort of issue. But over the long term, the way the market works out is that the Bitcoin miners get pushed towards whatever's cheap, whatever's stranded. Right. Another thing we see that, for example, in Texas, especially them because they have that closed grid, there's a need for demand response. And so Texas has a lot of wind and a lot of solar power just because of their geography. They're very prone to those resources. And so they have, if you look at over the past, say, 10 years, they have an increasing percentage of the time where they have negative energy pricing, negative electricity pricing. And it's because, say in the middle of the day, it's a sunny day, you have a spike in electricity production, but you don't have a spike in demand. And so that electricity gets curtailed. And so one way that they deal with that is to have demand response. So they can say, for example, we have fluctuating supply. We don't know if it's going to be windy. We don't know if it's going to be sunny. And so if we start to encounter shortages, a consumer electricity can shut off, right? And of course, some things can shut off and some things can't. A hospital can't shut off, but other things can. And the thing that they can shut off most easily is Bitcoin miners. They're very flexible. They're not doing anything that's critical, and because they're only part of the network, and so they're able to shut off. And so Bitcoin mining has been very productive in demand response, where they say, okay, we'll negotiate with the electricity provider and we'll get the lowest rate they offer. But we're first in line to have to shut off if there's a shortage.
Right.
And that's been working very well for them. But now you have groups come in and want to restrict their ability to do that, even though it's actually benefiting the grid. And actually, if you look closely, some of the groups that are going against it are the companies that operate gas peaking plants, because they're actually a competitor for Bitcoin miners there, where, if you build all these gas plants and you can rapidly turn on and off your gas plants, you're another option that you can compete with Bitcoin miners for that demand response. You can always get more electricity on very quickly. And so you actually see some of them lobbying against Bitcoin mining. So it's actually one of those things where there's public misperception around it, there's political misperception, and then there's some competing interests that can purposely muddle that perception.
On the political side, we do have the Biden administration looking to put a 30% tax on Bitcoin mining. In the Biden 2024 federal budget, there's a proposal for the digital asset mining energy excise tax, or DAME, as it's been called, and that's going to tax up to 30% of crypto miners' electricity costs in 10% increments spread over 3 years, starting January 2024. And the narrative is that this is geared towards combating climate change with the revenue that it raises. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that goes back to my prior point, that Bitcoin mining is such a small percentage of global energy usage. And again, it's generally non-rival energy. I mean, if you look at...
But do you think that this could get passed? And why do you think that this is coming from the Biden administration in particular?
So I think a lot of it's perception. I think a lot of politics today is around theater. They have to show to their constituents that they're taking action. Now, the amount of revenue this would raise compared to a $2 trillion deficit that the government's running is minimal, right? So it's not going to be a significant revenue booster. And then to the extent that it impacts the climate, I think it would have minimal positive impact. And you can actually make the case that it has a negative impact, because one thing that Bitcoin mining does is it actually makes variable energy sources more competitive. So instead of curtailing a lot of electricity that comes from solar, wind, hydro, things like that, it actually makes those more reliable to build, because they have a guaranteed buyer for their various fluctuating energy. So it's not clear it would have any impact on the climate. It would have minimal impact on the budget. And I think it's more of that narrative game. So I don't think it'd be good policy. As far as it passing, I think, we're in a very divided setting here. So I think the chance of anything that's controversial passing is low. But because I don't focus on political strategy, I don't really have an edge in determining what's actually likely to pass or not.
Okay, yeah, politics has played quite a big role in the conference this year. We heard from presidential candidate Robert Kennedy Jr. talking about Bitcoin and talking about CBDCs. As we wrap up, Lyn, any takeaways from the conference so far this year?
I think one takeaway to your final point is the bipartisan nature of Bitcoin. And so Bitcoin was more quickly embraced by the Republican Party. But to your point, we had one of the leading Democratic candidates speak at a Bitcoin conference. And there was a book published just months ago called "The Progressive Case for Bitcoin." Is a progressive person writing positive about Bitcoin for other progressives. And I think we're seeing kind of footholds where Bitcoin is not just seen as a conservative or libertarian adjacent technology, and instead it's one that's at least certain segments of the political left are embracing more. And the reason that's kind of useful is that when you do get sort of controversial bills that could really go after miners or choke Bitcoin away from the banking system and things like that, it gets much harder to pass when you have at least significant minorities on both sides that are willing to go to bat for it. So I think that's
it's a positive then, for sure.
It's one of the most constructive takeaways I have from this conference, yes.
So that there is political will on both sides of the aisle to, if not boost Bitcoin, not curtail it.
Yeah, I think at least defend it from the biggest tail risks that can really slow it down.
That is a big positive. Do you see Bitcoin, and I know you're not a political strategist, as you mentioned, but do you see Bitcoin becoming a bigger campaign issue this year?
I don't know about this year, but so the larger it grows, the more likely it becomes a campaign issue. But I think where it becomes relevant is that, it won't be for most people their biggest campaign issue, but there's a increasing but small percentage of people for which they're single issue voters over Bitcoin. And given how tight elections are, especially in certain states, if you have 3% of the population that is willing to switch sides or not vote or vote independent based on a candidate's Bitcoin position, I think that will reach a point where, it's not like 30% of people are super focused on Bitcoin.
Right.
Instead, that 3% are hyper-focused on it. And I do think that becomes increasingly politically relevant in either the next Bitcoin cycle or the one after that.
And overall, a positive, therefore, for Bitcoin.
Yes.
Okay. Well, Lyn, thank you so much. Appreciate you sharing your thoughts on macroeconomics and political strategy, which you've been tremendously insightful, even though you've mentioned you're not a political strategist, but thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Lyn Alden, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And as always, thank you for watching. I'm Michelle Makori. If you are watching this on YouTube, make sure to subscribe, and we'll see you next time.
Kitco News special coverage of Bitcoin 2023 is brought to you by Coin Payments. Crypto payments made easy.